Good morning, everybody. My name is Professor Tom Kovac. RMIT University. I'm also the creative director for SUPERCITY project, which has been an ongoing studio program for Iskandar Buteri in Malaysia, investigating the future of cities. And what we are going to be doing this morning is hearing a talk by Patrik Schumacher, who will be discussing designing of eloquent cities, which is a research conversation or lecture about how briefing information and research information is distributed to students and schools to become kind of the underpinning of how we can think about future cities and how we can think about architecture form and have a new repertoire of thinking about production. So without any further ado, we've been here for quite a while. I'm sure you all want to hear Patrik Schumacher. Patrik is the principal of Zaha Hadid Architects. He was also a studio leader with me and Michaela Pascal in SUPERCITY project this semester, or some of the projects you will hear about and see this afternoon. But without going on, Patrik Schumacher.
Thank you, Tom, first of all, giving me this platform, inviting me, hosting this event, SUPERCITY, the studio we were teaching in Melbourne. This is also, I want to mention UAM Sunrise, who is our client in Melbourne, a fantastic residential project that I think involved in this whole venture. And yeah, so I will talk about the Eloquent City for about an hour, roughly, and then hopefully there's a bit of time to interact with Q&A, and later, after a break, we go up to discuss some student works. So designing the Eloquent City is the city that communicates its complexity and dynamism to its users and therefore makes that complexity viable. And I've been more and more come to the point of realization that our core competency is spatial communication. Since we've lost most of our engineering responsibilities, technical functionality responsibilities to the various engineering specialisms, what is left is two things. It's organization and articulation, and articulation is communicating the organization and the social ongoings, and that is something we do through the built environment becomes a visual language of explaining itself, because it becomes complex and difficult to understand, and we no longer moving through the same spaces on a routine basis that we know them already by heart, but we're moving into new spaces, different districts of cities, new cities all the time. So we're relying on some kind of orientation, navigation capacity. Of course, we're also relying on these things, but if we use GPS and follow the blue dot, we see nothing. We have a preordained destination, and then we stare at this blue dot, and we don't participate in the city. So that's the problem. We need to navigate an intuitive city, and that's what I'm problematizing here under the heading of the Eloquent City. So our values very generally with respect to this is values of not only Zaha Hadid Architects, of the whole movement of Parametricism, as well as the Design Research Lab. And this is the kind of resources I'm using to visualize some of our these values and thinking. Complexity, first of all, and that complexity comes through the societal processes, but we need to make that a value, because it's what makes the next level of prosperity gains possible in terms of a very complex and intricate and dynamic cooperation process. Order, yes, this complexity needs to have some kind of order so that we can actually navigate and orient within it and not confront it with a menacing disorder. And that means that order must become legible, which is an additional problem, because maybe it's intricately ordered, where things relate and are located so that they belong and work together, but if you don't perceive that, if you don't notice in the complex urban scenes where the various offerings and interconnections are, we also fall short. And just want to very briefly show the project what I mean by ordering and making particularly legible that order. It's a very simple project in Strasbourg. It's a park and ride scheme, and I think it's important. You can see immediately the conspicuous, strong figure which invites itself to be grasped and understood in this kind of disordered, disfigured urban landscape you find everywhere around cities and within cities, and you see immediately the difference. And if you imagine two car parks, a tram station, a bus station to be located, it will quite quickly disappear in this undecipherable nowhere, identityless spill. So what we're doing here is we're using architectural composition and kind of nearly graphic, articulated approach to architecture to make the relationships very clear. So for instance, this is one unified car park pulling you across and into the tram station and bus station. The tram cuts in here, the bus cuts in here, and we're using graphic means to make these connections very strong. This is cut apart by a road, but that's hardly noticeable. The road is in the way, it's a contingent condition which doesn't belong to the essence of the project, so we suppress its presence and we emphasize the presence of this connection, and curvature helps and other graphic means help. And every pragmatic element, whether it's a surface to hold cars, a demarcation to orient cars, a lamppost to light, has a double function. It has a technical function, and it has a language, articulatory, visual communication function. So all these lampposts are made similar to these demarcations. They create a swarm of lines pulling you through. They grow in height, and then as they bring you into the station, they flow in and become columns. The demarcation lines become light cuts. So we're making very different pragmatic elements, very similar because they participate in a visual communication venture which is giving them the same communication function. And you can see here the cuts indicating where the various vehicles would come in, and the swarm of lampposts and demarcation lines has kind of drawn you in. It's very, very conspicuous, very clear. And this brings it home that the roof of the tram station and the floor of the car park look very, very similar. Why? They're very different things technically, but they're participating in one unified compositional communication effort. At night this function as well. So all the elements here are perfectly viable in their pragmatic delivery of technical functionality. So you have always so many choices that you can have additional orchestration choices where the communication aspect can be delivered without compromising the slightest, the technical trivialities, let's say. That's engineering business, and that's what architects' business is. Just quick, because I will show you many more images and will not go into detailed explanation of all of them. This approach applies to, and you can also see there was curvature, there was angles, because you adapt these figures into complex sites. You don't, if you have a complex diagonal site and you put boxes in it, it also falls apart. So you have to have the flexibility to curve, to skew, to adapt and maintain a figure. So that's why we use curvature, because we're living in complex and working complex scenarios. And this now works from urban scale through architectural scales, interior scales, but also to product and furniture scales. And we'll just click through some of the projects we've been realizing, which are meant to be very articulate in where entrances are, where the parts of the institutions are, and how they connect and fuse, etc. But always, these projects also show you that many things come together visually, that you have the various spaces communicating with each other, open to each other, transparent to each other, intervisible with each other. And what you see is the variety of forms. It's nearly like the endless forms of nature. So it's, if you compare to the oeuvre of another architect, there's a much more self-similarity. There is something which binds all these together, certain complexity, intricacy, and organic unity, but like the endless forms of nature, they're very, very different species at play. And that's another feature of this contemporary work. And there's differentiation of species, and variety of articulation is increasing all the time. So you can see there's a family of things, but if you look closer, there are very different typologies and figures and approaches at play. There's always this element of embedding and contextualizing and creating potentially also gradients between building and pathways between building and landscape, etc. But we're working in very different conditions, so it's a radically different project. But what it shares is the internal openness, the emphasis of a navigation space throughout. The ability to connect up with existing structures and landscape affiliations. So it's these kind of things are mediators between different conditions. So they don't drop in like a preconceived figure. They come in and mold themselves, allow themselves to be molded and adjusted to their surroundings, built and landscape. Yeah, come here, more space. Maxi also is a project of embedding, picking up the grain and size of existing structures, picking up different urban directions, mediating them, and letting them infuse the complexity of the urban conditions, motivates also an internal complexity in the building itself. And the idea of spaces flowing into each other, not being separate, the simplicity of separate spaces, A, B, C, D, neatly separated and kept apart, that's no longer part of the way society functions. So spaces are open to each other, flow into each other, morph into each other. It's a continuous, ever-changing trajectory. Sometimes, again, opening up across sections, so there's intervisibility of many things going on, multiple levels in multiple directions. And that's a typical condition of complexity. And that requires, again, compositional grasp. So you can see here as well, there's a compositional unity similar to the tram station project, where all the elements, where there are ribs, staircases, lighting features, fall under a formalism of these kind of flow lines, parallel lines, and therefore they can participate in an overall clarification of spatial sequences of movement, etc. So this, again, doubling up of pragmatic element as elements of a formal language is very important. And also moving from inside to outside seamlessly with similar sets of spaces, and a certain rigorous generator of the spatial conditions as well. This project is sectionally organized, so everything is communicated to the facade, where the various parts of the institutions are, where the main cuts and public spaces are, and light penetrating to mark that. So principles like this are important. And always this idea of multi-level spaces with multiple deep vistas layered in all directions, including vistas back to the exteriors, often very important. Here we're also using color coding. There's a dark gray and a light gray, communicating the library condition versus the student center condition. And then there's a lot of these large orientation spaces. It's interesting that the tilting is also orienting information. Wherever you are, however deep in the building you are, the tilt shows you where's the exit, where's the entrance, where you participate back to the main plaza, as well as the lighting moves you through the primary circulatory cuts with naturally lit. And you get spaces like this again, where you see across levels and you see many things, events going on, and again, getting an overview and orientation condition at every corner, deep vistas all the way to the exterior as well, to keep oriented. And that's a general feature of our work, and that of course potentially leads to a visual overload. So then you need to come back and have this clarifying language where you're reducing visual chaos and complexity through kind of formal unification. In a project like this is similar operating. You see the three parts of the institution, the conference center, the central library, the museum. You can see where it opens up for a central entrance. These spaces are interesting, where you have multiple vistas in all directions. It spills out to the garden. The same formalism structures the garden on the outside. There are different exterior spaces. So the figure is very different and different silhouettes, but it's obviously recognizable as one unified whole. Whereas modernist compositions like this could often fall apart. If you look for the bowers on different sides, you don't even know it's the same building. And again, what is important here is something like where we treat a staircase. It's not an additional element which clutters the scene, but it unifies and works together with lighting system, add the steps together, give you a plasticity enhancement of the space and the guiding, rather than cluttering up and confusing the scene. It emphasizes the essential configuration of the space. And you get this kind of form of minimalism in the detail by the maximal complexity in the overall configuration, rather than the traditional minimalism where you just have a box after box. You see the deep layered vistas everywhere. And then you see a change in material, radical, but you know you're still in the same building because the same sort of formal principles apply. Again, instead of adding staircase and acoustic panel, everything is developed out of the surface itself. And again, this is our Beijing project where our own Beijing office is, the attempt to build a three-dimensional 360-degree interface of communication with many, many offerings, there's hundreds of startup companies, cafes, bars, shops, hangout spaces, there's WeWork zones at the bottom as well, mixing in with the retail areas, etc., that this becomes broad and empowers users to have at their fingertips many, many offerings simultaneously, and yet have principles and logic, so you don't get lost in this, in these kind of concave spaces, and then on the inside, this continues with opening up the section in the atriums as well. And this is the way we've been designing office buildings in particular, with internal hollow spaces. All our towers are trying to be hollow right now. The ability to adapt in complex conditions, multi-level, so as underground spaces pour in, higher level things flow on top, you flow below, on top, and in between in these kind of projects. There's a reduction of visual complexity where a lot of the windows and so on are hidden behind a perforation skin, and then emphasizing only major moves like cuts for entering and moving through, etc. So that the scene is ordered and grasped, rather than made complex. And there's a lot of windows behind here, actually. And from the inside, in fact, you actually can see through this mesh quite easily, and you don't feel cut off. But from the outside, it becomes more well-ordered and articulated condition. And it's in the center of Seoul. Similarly, it's the research center in Saudi Arabia. What you can see here, drivers like wind and sun. Parameters capture both the solid buildings with their courtyards and the canopies, so two radically different technical systems become similar again, partly because of compositional will to form for articulation sake, but also because a set of parameters capture both of these subsystems. And you can see literally how the wind flows in, as it were, and the sun is kept out in these. And there's special spaces like maybe a sacred space, which is different yet similar, using similar geometries. And again, complexity of inside, multiple spaces, and hollowing out of towers, voids, communication voids, navigation. The elevators are panoramic elevators crossing this, bridges, to connect between the different sides of the towers. The elevators would be running here, etc. And multiple buildings forming a unity with the landscape. And an opera house, and museum. And again, the lobby spaces, opportunities to connect across levels, to have great intermission spaces where you can see who's there, what's going on, etc. Matinees could be played, and the space itself is becoming some kind of a media space and articulate, eloquent space. Finally, the airport using architectural features as main navigation orientation devices. Central, you come in, a central orientation space, and then these petals pull you out to the gates. It's a very, very clear structure, and using section to heighten axes and entrance conditions, bring you in and bring you to grand orientation space, and then pull you throughout the gates in these gaps using light. As well, to light the central space, we have these kind of cupolas. And this is the thing, these big petals, column free, one main column and two other touch joint points pulling through and creating the central space, and then a very, very clear trajectory to the gates. You can see that here being constructed. So that's examples of this. Architecture must speak. This is a slogan which actually was brought forth by the postmodernists first, after the monotony and, let's say, muteness of modernist city, which was designed only on engineering principles, and was deliberate to some extent. If you look at the ABC group, Hannes Meyer, you know, it's function times economy equals architecture, supposedly. There's no recognition, an explicit denial of visual, compositional agendas, because he didn't understand that those would be functional in a deep way. He thought that aesthetic values, visual compositional pursuits would be detract from the economy and engineering rationality. But that's a fallacy, because we need, these spaces are no longer functioning socially because it's so disorienting. Actually, I'm living in this kind of row house, and I have to concentrate every time I go to get home to find my own entrance. And that's really painful. And that shouldn't be the case. And imagine that you not know where you're going. So these are the images of the mute city. And this was literally a program and manifesto, the work of Hilbersheimer, for instance. This is what we have instead, much more rich, maybe more legible, but the more of these icons pile into each other in a random fashion, you don't have a sense of where it goes. You can't infer what is unseen from what is seen. So this becomes a noisy city, another thing which we should avoid. So what's the eloquent city? Which is somewhere between the noisy city and the mute city, or something third, something really desirable. And I think it has to be built on a complex, variegated order. Again, I'm showing you what the modernists thought the city should be looking like, and it's incredibly disorienting. All the blocks repeat, all the floors repeat, all the window bays repeat. But maybe it works for a society where there's only 5 things, and you don't need to differentiate. And in any way, you're going to the same slot every Monday morning for the 30 years. Then this might work, but not in contemporary conditions where you're meeting different different people every day, and you need to roam the city and find new partners, gather in new scenarios. Then this becomes incredibly disorienting. Okay, now you can use GPS, but as I said earlier, GPS isn't the right way, because you have to know what you can only follow your preconceived schedule. So these kind of vision of a Hilbersheimer became a dystopia, became quite quickly understood to be kind of menacing and problematic. So Super Studio is, in these kind of visions, is of course an ironic play on this world, the rejection of this world, an exaggeration and thereby a rejection. And then we have, moving into this scene, where somebody like Ungers, who used to do this, not ironically, for real, then moved into this, using history to be inspired, but the idea of making every building individual and different. The problem with this is, very, very soon, you're confronted with a difference of 50 blocks. If they're not ordered, if they're not structured, it's incomprehensible. They need to be kind of hierarchized and ordered and sequenced, maybe gradients, etc. So let's realize this becomes better than the monotony, but quite quickly also indigestible. That becomes a noisy city. Or the way Remsch thought. He was interested in the freedom of expression of each of these blocks. But how can anybody absorb a grid of pure difference with hundreds or thousands of differences? That is collapsing into noisiness, into illegibility. So that's not the way. But architecture must speak at the Biennale in 1980 was a big theme, and you had this kind of exaggerated differentiation of identities on the street, and again, the identity of the overall street collapses with this principle of collage. That was Collage City at the time, or some kind of pop, a recitation of historic fragments. Anyway, so that's one part of the lecture. I want to go a bit deeper and say why all this matters so much, that for society to operate, we need spatial order to structure our social processes, and that's what the role of the built environment is. And an ordering matrix which we rely on, but it only, of course, functions if we can actually grasp it, if it becomes transparent to us, because we're not robots which get GPS signals. So the city is a gigantic sorting machine to order the total social process, and can only do it if it's an eloquent city, I would argue. And yes, a place for everything in its place, but if you don't find this place, you kind of become dysfunctional once more. It's also something which we need to recognize, that the city evolves and grows and continuously updates and enlarges the order of society. And that's very important. It's a substrate of cultural evolution. So you start with small aggregations, and you can see here that the various status groups and activity types are stabilized and allocated, and that allows a social organism of cooperation to be built, which is larger than a flock of 25 apes or chimpanzees, let's say. And you can make larger and larger. You can build this out ring by ring and accumulate across generations and the centuries larger and larger social structures. You have something to hook onto, and that's very important. But you can see also here the differentiation of this and the necessity of any society being kind of structured and stabilized and ordered by its built environment. You can see that everywhere, that you know who is who. Each space has certain entry requirements and threshold requirements, and it needs to be structured to have meaningful structured conditions. And in the contemporary, if you want to have a meeting, you have some kind of ordered congregation, you need something to hook onto. And so we're starting to simulate what various spatial offerings might mean. And of course, that is something you have to explore, and there's a language to this, because it's not necessarily physically natural and necessary that these four cubes would lead to these kind of pairwise gatherings. So we're starting to simulate spaces and furnishing conditions and configurations to understand what they mean, what their efficacy is, and how we should design them. Because the purpose of any design is, in my way, to organize societal interactions, cooperative interaction, for the sake of enhancing our life qualities, prosperity, etc. And we can do that on larger scales. This is actually something from DRL quite a few years ago, where actually the various architectural elements which help the ordering process are themselves dynamic and responsive. Looking back at history, so you find no society without built environments. And as societies evolve and become more complex, the built environment becomes more nuanced, complex, the semiology becomes particular, and it's a human universal. So an apparatus like the Chinese dynastic imperial government needs a architectural machine to operate. And this has also various details, down to the smallest detail. And you can see that is a human universal wherever you go. And I want to point out that it is not only the different settings, but also the different costumes. So the differentiation of the social personas and status groups tied in with the architecture, but also tied in with another design element, which I'm interested in. We could call it fashion design now. At the time, it was something much more ritualized, and there's not much freedom to choose. Now we're choosing to self-sort into semiological matrix. At the time, these kind of were quite rigorously ritualized and not freely chosen, but very important to communicate at any stage who is who, what's the ranking relationships, the access relationships, etc. So this is another human universal that you would have a design, graphic design overlay on the human body, as well as a graphic design, a decorative overlay, a semiological overlay on the built environment as well. But the whole point is here that the roles differentiation requires this conspicuous marking. And again, this folds back onto the built environment as well. There is no built environment which doesn't have that, let's call it a graphic semiological overlay, because it couldn't function without that. It would be too primitive, undifferentiated, no. So from animal to human is precisely this, the built environment and the self-styling. And of course it's not, oh, I want to look cool. This is about expressing and articulating who you are so that people can relate to you properly. You don't have to try to find meaningful communication partners in a totally random process. And this is a problem actually. If this kind of homogeneity takes us out, ideologically depletes that, there's problems potentially. And that's why this kind of comes back strongly in the 80s, when you actually have a takeoff of new level of complexity in post-Fordist network society, what I call neoliberalism. You actually also have the re-emergence, strong re-emergence of expressiveness in fashion. So you know, there's all the potentials you can express yourself. And there's also guidance. How do you dress up for various occasions on the spectrum from casual to formal, both female and male? But this, of course, there's much more to this than this. So that's why we are not ashamed to join and contribute to the fashion system. It's very profound and deep in its sociological and significance. So we're looking at the world of architecture like a chess game. So you have, on the one hand, you have the chess grid and maybe more complex arenas to move, and you have the various characters differentiated. So, and when we do our crowd models now, we also have differentiated crowds, and they make different moves in different scenarios. Fashion system is part of it, but the whole point is this kind of social functionality. We need to look at the built environment's ordering capacity as society advances and becomes more complex. And these are metaphors I'm using again, where these demarcations don't need to be physical walls. They're just different thresholds you can cross and understand. It's an information system. So these demarcations tell you what to do, where, and what can do, what the rules are, who's at play, etc. And so we're not talking about shelter, because some of this is architecture, profoundly ordering without being shelter. So it is the communicated demarcations which count, and a system of such demarcations and invitations with various protocols of interaction is what counts. So what this means is that there's various characters. There's team A, team B, the referee, the keeper, various zones in which different rules and protocols of interaction apply. That makes an ordered, structured social interaction like this game possible, and that's the way we have to look at the built environment, where there's a difference between a cocktail party and a seminar, and they have different spaces and different rules of interaction. And so we're starting to simulate that in work environments, which have various types of settings, and with different characters and different settings, different types of communication, and to get a handle on understanding and evaluating eventually what the various settings mean, what their encounter potentialities are, what the rules of engagement are, whose spaces they are, and therefore to orchestrate the social ordering capacity of architecture, but also paying attention to design, differentiation, the various settings through their morphologies, their stylistic characterization, their ornateness, etc. So that's architecture's contribution to societal development. Ordering of social processes via organization, where you place these things, but also articulating, inform users where is what, and what spaces are for, and who's welcome, and whose spaces they are. And that I call the communicative capacity of the built environment is something we have to develop, and for that we're developing the design and the built environment as a medium of communication. And we can qualify different environments with respect to their degree of information richness. Another analogy we're looking at is the built environment, the traffic sign systems. And here you can see it's a big semiological system. Somebody's designed this, and it allows many different people moving about the city to coordinate their movements. In this stage, to stay out of each other's way. Cyclists, pedestrians, cars of various kinds. And of course, the societal process is much more complex. We're not just avoiding each other. We want to find each other, engage with each other, communicate with each other, approach each other in various forms and types of interaction. So it's much more complex than this, but it's an example, and we start using the examples of sports games, traffic sign systems, chess, etc., to develop an architecture understood like this. And if you structure the field rather than a gray, undifferentiated field, you can have more ordered and quicker form self-organizing processes, because these are based on freedom and free action of agents, but they know the rules of the game, they know how to avoid being elephant in a porcelain shop and to fit into an overall organizational pattern. So again, historically this moves up, and that this is circular is nearly natural, that a circular enclosure grows in rings concentrically is clear. You differentiate organs like the church, community space, the market space, and the rest is kind of various crafts. And there's a kind of self-organization, self-ordering, a model which replicates across Europe. Then the Big Bang of architecture, where this is picked up and drawn up, and then it becomes design, initially in the early Renaissance, and it becomes much more conspicuous and clear, but in the end, on the overall plan, it's still just a medieval city. The design city is just copying and rationalizing a little bit the evolved and undesigned city. But then you'd be quite quick to project this out. The next step, expanding it into the horizon with these larger structures, Versailles, the Baroque of Louis XIV, the Baroque of, let's say, Rome, the papal Rome. These are larger structures, larger entities, and the new style comes to the fore, which allows to encompass much larger structures. So the different styles from let's say the medieval vernacular into the Renaissance, into the Baroque, they mark different stages of an increasingly complex and large society with different socio-economic rules, the Baroque city. Then comes the laissez-faire industrial capitalist city, and then the industrial state capitalist planned city of the 20th century after the socialist takeovers, let's say. And you have municipal governments and central governments, and then you can roll out and radically reconceive much more complex in a sense that you have radically different types of urban districts, the business district, the residential district, logistics districts, the manufacturing districts. But relative to what we're thinking of now, quite simple, because these districts are separate. Then could be quite different, specialized, and then repetitive inside. So this is an idealization. It fits with the mechanical mass reproduction, and so you lose symmetry, proportion, you lose concentric order, you have an open texture of which could expand in all directions. It's more complex, with the danger of becoming illegible quite quickly, by the way, and amorphous. But it's fascinating how Corbusier was anticipating 24 what would happen in terms of the built environment of the 20th century. So this is the era of Fordism, of mechanical mass reproduction, and we need to think of the next stage where we need much more articulation. So this city was working, if you have 9 to 5, everybody is in this kind of simple routine. Everybody has the same thing, the same house, the same car, the cornflakes, the washing machine, the TV with one channel or two, the packaged holiday. You can reproduce that. Relatively simple. It's not the complex, dynamic world cities of today. They could use this modernist repertoire. But then the 80s onwards, with the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, with the computational revolution, with the re-injection of capitalist dynamics, the ability to plan this in a top-down way was missing. And you see what happens from Fordism to post-Fordism. Here we were all standing in line for 30 years in the assembly line, in the bureaucracy, of the administrative assembly line. Now, nobody is there anymore. That moves by itself. The administrative bureaucracy with the rooms full of typists, that's all computational process. So everybody is set free to pull together in a city and do research, development, finance, marketing, innovation, meeting and reconfiguration. It's a very, very different role of the city. Instead of spreading everybody out and putting them into their slot, we have to kind of roaming and aggregating in this post-fortive network society. And we need a new style. So you can see that the various styles line up with the various eras of civilization and socio-economic systems, and now we're in a different condition. So we need to see that Marx, in the sense, was right, technology is a driver, where we have the technologies of the assembly line and of mechanical powered industry. Now we have the computational revolution, the telecommunication revolution, the internet and AI and so on, robotics. And that means that we have a different social process, a different city, and a different society, which I call post-forest network society. So, and we're moving from this kind of manufacturing city to this integrated R&D, finance, marketing city. And this city on the left had the industrial and then the residential. And here everything moves in, and the components, I think, should look like this. There should be this kind of hubs of communication, but well, more ordered than what we're looking at here. So this is still problematic, but I'm just setting the scene for the Eloquent city. So this is the city as a kind of knowledge society superbrain. It's only communication processes. Nobody's doing physical work. The physical work is happening in the factories, robotic factories, in the robotic landscapes. I mean, tractor robots doing agriculture, manufacturing. I mean, if you go to BMW, nobody's in the workshops. Even the so-called blue-collar workers, they're just handling screens and checking the robots and reprogramming. And everything there, and even in the manufacturing industry, there's hardly any physical workers anymore, certainly not at BMW, where it's all research, development, engineering, auditing, even on the site production. If you go to construction industry, contractor, more than 50% are actually engineers and technicians and managers. And as we also industrialize the built environment production, we'll have this more and more universalized. And so manufacturing is officially like only 20% of the workforce. Agriculture only 1% left in the advanced countries. But if you look at the 20%, actually more than half of it is actually white-collar workers too, or maybe 60-70%. So there's nobody. And we're moving from this kind of hierarchy into this dynamic ecosystem of interaction, where you reinvent yourself every few months, where you work in various constellations, networking up with various collaborators. We do that all the time, meet. And the buildings will have to look otherwise. And the bureau Landschaft, that's already started to happen in the 70s. It becomes more open, more fluid, more reconfigurable, field-like, and you can see here already the seeds of a parametricism sensibility, field conditions, swarms, etc. And that's for me very important, and we radicalize it, that the intuitions also of deconstructivism, of complexity, interpenetration, overlap, and then of parametricism, folding, etc. There are deeply profound intuitions about the complexity of societal processes. We're moving from the left to the right side in terms of the interaction in spaces. And this is the spaces we're doing now, a big technology center for Sberbank in Russia, the way we're trying to make this open 3D bureau Landschaft texture with a lot of dynamism and reconfigurability. A lot of these offices don't have allocated seats. We did this just in Antwerp, 500 people, and nobody has their own seat. They're roaming around in a deteriorized settings freely with, and you don't need 500 seats, you need maybe 350 seats, but non-allocated to 500 people. So we've been on to this for quite a while and making complex, layered, overlapping and dynamic environments, cross sections. And then we're trying now to see how we can try to understand what these mean. We can look at them, they know they're complex, they know they have various conditions of overlap, but to get more precisely which configuration of overlap, which distribution of meeting zones, which entrance and exit points would lead to a maximization of encounters, maybe between departments, within departments. how the managers get most interface connections with various staffs and exterior visitors. We have no clue, we're agnostic. We need these simulation processes to make sense of these complex environments. Because it's no longer trivial, you just draw a plan and say this is department A and this is these 5 people and 25 people who sit there, and you have enough area and you have placed them. That's not what we're talking about. That's why we need to hollow out our buildings also, that people can kind of see where they should be nesting this morning versus the next morning, where events are structured, instead of slicing up the tower into 100 different floors and each floor cut up by a core and rooms, so that you have thousands of people segregated off each other. They need to be in each other's faces and the view back to the city, to the next tower. And so these are the visions of new kind of corporate environments or towers which we developed for places like Rwanda. And you literally have a kind of inter-visibility of thousands of people. And you still try to structure this with varying depths of slabs and so on. And this is the next one we're doing for Taikang and So again, just going through the historical sequence, and from modernism we moved into postmodernism and deconstructivism. And what the problem was with these, they had the variety. Postmodernism was constrained to kind of historical motifs. Deconstructivism quite quickly became kind of a visual chaos, which was different to navigate and wasn't generalizable. So these are transitional, a decade each, and I think Parametricism for the last 20 years, 25 years, this is what we're trying to forge as the next epochal style after modernism. So all the elements are malleable, so they can relate to each other, adapt to each other, form synergetic clusters rather than being just left inert. So they're sensitive to each other and to site conditions. And that's very important for this kind of relation building, relationships within the built environment, relationships between the built environment and its exterior. So a totally new repertoire to create something much more dense, intricate, varied, but well ordered. Instead of this, which actually even in Rome already, this principle led to some kind of indigestible collage city, which was then again the slogan of Colin Rowe. Better than the monotonous Brasilia, but compared to what could be, still very dysfunctional. So we need to work with algorithms to start working on what I call this complex variegated order, which we need. We can't just have complexity raw in an agglomeration. We need to have intricately varied and structured and order. So that's what we're doing with these projects. Surfaces need to be able to ripple and fold and adapt and resonate and have internal logics which are in a dialectic with external influences, as it were. So these are the kind of projects which come out of this. And this is now already 25 years in and blobs, so we have foldism, blobism, and swarmism as different stages of parametricism. And this is very potent. You can pick up and affiliate to existing grains, and then you have at the same time an internal differentiation logic, and you can create unity across differences and even encompass existing structures. So it's not tabula rasa concept. You can actually incorporate existing textures and overlay and integrate them into more unified themes. And in the last stage of this sequence, or parametricism is old, it has a series of subsidiary styles, like modernism has white modernism, or functionalism, brutalism, metabolism, high-tech. We now have a series of subsidiary styles, and we're moving into this zone of tectonism. And what is interesting about it in terms of expressive versatility, it's much more powerful than the previous stage, which was only NURB surfaces. They're great because they're very flexible and malleable and they can lots of figures, but this is much more rich and varied because the geometries where they are minimal surfaces, ruled surfaces, curved folding, topology optimized reticulation conditions. Each manufacturing paradigm delivers its own particular expressive characteristics and identity, and then creates whole families of varied conditions which you can then draw together with these, and they work well together and they work well in contrast and similitude. So that's then something which we started to want to apply to these urban models on the next articulated level. So these urban models are still kind of earlier versions of parametricism, They're also far too much single hand, and we need to move into multi-author. There is multi-author in the contemporary condition, and that's visual chaos. I mean, it's great, it's in a sense intense and exciting, but also you have no clue what's coming around the corner. Anything could happen at any point, and that's quite disorienting. That's Moscow City, by the way. This is London, I've shown you a few times. So this, we want this intensification, but nobody loves and likes what comes with it. The identityless, strange white noise sameness of all cities. No character. You don't know where you are, which district you are, which city you are. We can work against this with planners taking authority. What could we do? What could happen to overcome this? So urban planning is out. I don't want to go into detail this. That simply the planners have no chance to have the knowledge, nor do they have the incentive to really stitch up this intricate synergy network which our cities should become. So we need the degrees of freedom for developers and architects to self-allocate, to program the sites in the way that they best exploit the surroundings and what they want to belong to. Because why are you coming to the city? To co-locate, to synergize, to cooperate. So you should be totally free to find the space of best location, to utilize the site best and not have some kind of arbitrary saying, oh, this is residential, this is commercial. That's all nonsense. That just kills the self-organization of the city. So we need an absolute bottom-up order on the programmatic side. And it needs to be competitive market process. The degrees of freedom are required to discover the synergy networks, the prosperity potentials, which no bureaucrat can know, nor there's an incentive to wanting to know. But this intricate complex order, which sometimes emerges in cities where you have a lot of freedom, leads at the moment to this visual chaos. So that's where we need to step up and make eloquent. We need to render this programmatic order visible through spatial morphological articulation. For that, the discipline is well geared up with parametricism, with its tools, and we need to want to do it, and we need to converge and forge this unified discipline and approach and ethos of making connections, stitching up resonances, of not being self-indulgent and arbitrary with what we bring to the city. We have the responsibility to bring something which fits in, affiliates, continues trajectories which have been placed, and really have the ethos of creatively, unpredictably. There's no one way of finding some way, our way, to develop a unified, legible texture rather than just coming in with some arbitrary imposition which relates to nothing and is our own hobby horse. So this is the garbage city. And no matter how great the individual architects are with their various impositions, as they all agglomerate, they generate garbage. No matter how beautiful the design, if you just dump thousands of different designers' products into a space without relationships, you will end up in kind of visual chaos. And of course, this was deconstructors and aestheticized this. But the question is, can we go beyond monotony and chaos? And that's where we're saying we can, and I'm writing about this, you can pick that up, some of the arguments in the AD Parametricism 2.0, hegemonic parametricism delivers market-based urban order. I mean, it's a vision, it's a future, it's an invitation to participate. I think it's possible. And the hint is that we should look at the complex, variegated natural systems as clues, as models, because the only thing which gives shape to spill like London is the river. It has direction, it has rhythm, it has form, it has shape, it has legibility, and this is all over the world like this. But of course there should be much more complex and intricate systems. Maybe road system look like this rather than a generic grid which tells you nothing. So these are complex variegated order. There is principle, there is a lot of variety and flexibility and contingency absorption, but there's a lot of, it's never arbitrary, it's always rule-based. So if we build up the city as a system of rule-based layers, we get there. And that's what we're starting to do. And we're looking at natural systems, they're all kind of real-life algorithms. And if we work like this, we generate that level of complexity, intricacy, variety, can continuously evolve and re-evolve. but there's principles behind which locate the element, and you can find them, you can navigate that. In animal, you can throw in that they would find their food source, because there are principles and gradients to follow. Like in these complex natural environments, much more primitive organisms like animals can actually navigate freely and find their prey, find their source of food. And peoples living in natural environment, they find their way in this. And that's what we're trying to do. It's kind of intricate, multi-species ecology, multiple layers and variations, open-ended, but never arbitrary. Never just throwing something, never just polluting, always intricately working in intelligently with developing creative and new algorithms to place and affiliate, to place the 500 Starbucks, or to place this particular building in a hub point. And let the market flow, let the various value differentiating of sites which are better, closer and higher values, close to underground station. Let the density be what it is. It will have these kind of beautifully flowing and gradient, let's say, density conditions you can navigate rather than arbitrary up to here and this, and then here's another rule which obfuscates the logics of the market rationality, the programmatic rationality. And somebody like Otto is great on many levels. He's also been into settlement structures and self-organizing principles there. And that's what we're trying to look at and utilize in some of our projects like this. But this is a single-hand project, and it could never be the whole city. Will be large sites, but there also will be sites which are multiple, very small interventions. And it is these kind of textures which become legible and navigable, which I believe in. I showed this earlier. But it's not the full story. This comes closer because there's multiple students doing different projects under similar principles. If you go close, they quite have rigorous identities and differences, but nevertheless they also form organic unity and wholeness and coherency. And that's the kind of model I would go by, and again interfacing natural environments with artificial environments. And this is beautiful because there's a lot of variety. There's also cuts and thresholds, but nothing is arbitrary. Where these cuts and thresholds emerge, and that's just models one could look at and emulate and play with and be inspired by. And this kind of multi-species ecology is what I'm going by. So if you have that mountain range where the water flows is given, where the vegetation comes on the north, south, east edge, how it gradually transforms as you go up, is all rules. And in their complex interplay, they create something quite intricate, but in the end, you grasp, you can find your way in it because it has logic and order, however intricate it is. Nothing is up random or totally random. So these will be the models, the scripted systems we like to offer. And again, the particulars of this would be complexity, but in that layered density of offerings, if they're ordered, there's also stratification where the offices are higher up and then the retail further down and the food and beverage at the very bottom level. But in these projects, not in this one, but in the client, they left this open. They're giving a differentiated space, and then you come in and you can place your shop, your office, your apartment, wherever you like, and it's kind of self-sorting. And maybe there is occasionally a little hair salon or nail space or small restaurants up here, so be it. But you still have order in the distribution and freedom, order and freedom at the same time. I'm looking at animals also fitting into this. Dynamic swarms are equally non-randomly findable and locatable in this environment, and that will be the other people we start to find in our environment. Or even the vernacular settlements would kind of rule-based fall into place. And to some extent, even in this random process we have now, there's certain hidden rules, but they become illegible because they're obfuscated by the stylistic willfulness of the architect, using any type, any morphology, the willfulness and arbitrariness of the planner who says here X, here Y. None of this makes sense, so all of this has to be wiped out and substituted by a kind of rational bottom-up process. But the discipline needs to have this kind of compositional visual overlay to clarify this. And that's what we're trying to do. So there's a lot of repetition in this. And some of our attempts to do this, to affiliate to a lot of existing structures, to pick up all the streets and flow them through, to have a differentiation of block sizes, and then self-sorting. You don't need to pre-allocate everything. It's not that it is so rigid, everything is necessarily here. It's an open texture, but it's a better open texture for settlement than an even grid. Here you can have the small company go into a small building, the large company into a large building, etc., etc. There are different conditions which we started to look at. And the networking of this, and bigger clusters, urban settlements weaving into the texture, and having larger clusters in our master plan conditions, trying to make legible the dynamics, and this is nearly this kind of value map rolled out literally. Of course, this is just indications. This is not something that we claiming we could build that whole city by ourselves. This is where I want to go, and I want to show you Google Campus also, different versions, where we're going. This is tectonism already, so you can see the differentiation. The morphologies are structurally based in various conditions and various projects, catenary based, shell based, and what you see already here quite quickly, that they're great, they vary, they're differentiated, they show the different spaces, but they become quite quickly monotonous as projects become large. So I want to say these three projects actually the different systems should be at play in one project, otherwise each of them becomes too monotonous. So we need to go actually, this tectonism differentiation needs to come into play, like the different pavilions of Achim Menges. And what is beautiful, you can have similarity across these two in form and material, similarities across here, and contrast across, and always similarity and contrast in different ways. So you can network up and articulate what belongs together, what is different in some respects, what is similar in other respects, and you orchestrate the complex language, and you need that repertoire. You couldn't do that with old Foldism, it's just NURB surfaces which are polished up. You need that to, otherwise you collapse into monotony in the contemporary conditions, like doing a large Google campus. So with that in mind, this is a model for me with all the intricate variations. There's unity across difference and difference in a kind of unified overall conditions with hierarchy, with nested logics. That's the eloquent city. We can discuss. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrik, for a very eloquent talk today. The future looks bright. Can we have questions from the floor, please, and open up a discussion? If you can pass the microphone around to anyone who's got questions, please.
Hi, Patrik.
Hi.
I've got a question regarding multi-authorship.
Yep.
And you briefly touched on this thing within the context of a free market
Yep.
system. So, and what you're also talking about is creating a semi-logical system which is in some way coherent across the entire city.
Yep.
So, in a free market system, when there's presumably multiple architects with multiple agendas, serving clients with multiple agendas, how do you, in some way, guide their work so that it becomes a city which is, coherent across the whole thing?
That's of course a challenge. That's, you put your finger on the kind of vulnerable point or on a key point. And what I believe is that yes, there's markets, there's economic process, but there's also discourse. And discourse comes on top very, very prominently. And discourse is now fueled and empowered by social media, where everything is debated and discussed and critiqued. But there's also disciplinary discourses. So what I believe, when the various entrepreneurs and clients, investors, institutions want to find their place in the city, they should be first of all totally free to imagine where they would fit in, or the developer who works the other way around, finding a site and then imagining which institutions would flourish here and be highest value. That's one premise. Now all of them, anybody, would of course call on a professional architect, an educated architect, a colleague of ours. That means a participant in the discourse of architecture. Because they would have been going to architecture school, they would show up at the Biennale, they would be under the influence of our discursive exploration of what's the most sophisticated and responsible way of developing an architecture. So that would be the guiding force, the discourse. And that's what I'm saying, in the discourse we could converge towards, and we should, and I'm proselytizing for it, the most sophisticated. These architects that would be hired, and anybody who would build something would have to hire and should hire a sophisticated architect who's fully aware of the agenda we're talking about, of the sophisticated tools one could deliver to this agenda, and we would also criticize each other. If somebody would kind of abuse that project in a kind of self-indulgent, primitive, backward fashion, it's like everybody be taking a doctor. Or we have an issue in the law, we take a lawyer, and we should rely on that we get sophisticated best practice. And they have their discourses and criticize each other. And if a doctor is kind of blundering about with 30-year-old therapies, which architects do all the time, that's not respectable anymore, and it couldn't be. Now, it's in architecture, it should also not be respectable. And if somebody's kind of abusing their position with the project and kind of falling short, we should kind of expose them, and their reputation would collapse very quickly, because what you should see is that reputations with respect to clients, who they want to select, is we through peer pressure, through peer selection, through exhibitions, professorships, biennales, competitions where we are actually the key jury members, we are generating our own stars. So the collective discursive process delivers the reputation, so we can control each other if we wanted to. And in the 1960s that was achieved. We had every self-respecting architect was understood modernism. The advance that modernism had, the rationalities, the principles, also the latest projects as references, they would work and act at the height of the discipline. Now, the problem is that our discipline is so confused, and kind of that conversion hasn't happened, or it started to happen actually through the 90s and early 2000s, and then was kind of defrayed by the financial crisis, the European debt crisis. That's my analysis. But we're not in that state where the discipline is in disarray right now, but it doesn't have to be like this. So the discipline coming through in this convergence with compelling arguments of best practice would deliver precisely that, where whoever would come in, and it would be for the good of the client. Because for the good of the client would be that precisely if he chooses this site to put this club, for instance, and hotel, next to this university and next to this retail zone and this bar area and the corporate in the background, that it's belonging to this cluster, and multiple affiliations would be expressed, would be gestured towards, would be articulated, these connections and what it belongs. That all the better for this institution, because it ties in visually with what it wants to tie in functionally, and that allows this social function to take off better. So I think it's not, we shouldn't see even a contradiction between the client's interest and the discipline's interest and societal interest so much. But at the moment it doesn't come through, because sometimes people also don't know what is their best interest, their well-considered interest. So there's a lot of learning to be had, but that's the role. Discourse is something additional, powerful above the raw market itself. But the market freedom must be in the background. So the discourse can't force. The discourse can just convince, influence, cajole, put pressure, reputational pressure, and that's actually the way a lot of social systems function now, through not only through police force and the big state coming down, but through reputation management, through liking, disliking, through kind of reputation building in the network. Very similar the way discourses function. Yeah.
Thank you, Patrik, for your talk today. It's really impressive to see someone 500 years of history, career, thesis. It's very, very, it's Like when you today, like I think everyone goes to the had to go through the Arsenal to come here,
Yeah.
which is like a gathering of mostly like niches,
Yeah.
like small fragments of spaces,
Yeah.
which like expressing free space, like which are like.
It's just a phrase. It's a meaningless phrase, but it's okay. I like the phrase, but
Yeah, because like my question goes to that. It's always like a task or change one, which is like building up opportunities for free space. And in the urban region, of course, we cannot do niche, so it's more like the extroverted, like when you go to Christopher Alexander, like he talks about the necessity of a corner as a way of bumping into each other, which leads them to the semi-lattice, or
Yeah.
the fluid communication in space. So when you now describe the city as a sorting machine in a way of communication, so does it allow gaps, free spaces, or what's your opinion for having a city of free space?
that's a good question I've always asked. Yes, I do allow for this. I mean, it can't be the one-liner thesis of the whole city, of any whole architecture, but I do believe in zones of indeterminacy. I also said some of the differentiations are just default differentiations, yet to be appropriated, so not fully allocated in advance. I believe in all of that, and I've recently written about object-oriented architecture because the theme of the withdrawn, excessive, yet to be networked, not yet networked, the virtual is the theme which comes strongly in this discourse, and we had it in the Parametricism discourse in the mid-90s, and it's been lost a little bit. We've concentrated too much on technical functionality, and I'm bringing back social functionality. And on the one hand, it means the capacity to have more specifically crafted and tailored spaces for particular audiences, social scenarios. But there's always dynamism and degrees of indeterminacy in there as well. Particularly if you look at a firm like Google, where you have a lot of free time. Therefore, you need free space for self-organization, not yet predicted, amongst a network of quite more determinate spaces. Because the indeterminacy cannot be a universal concept, but it's definitely within the theory, within the conception, within the repertoire, and within the tradition of Parametricism historically, through Deleuze-Guattari, through the concept of the virtual, and now re-injected through the triple O agenda, through some of the themes there. So I thank you for making the comment, and it's sometimes misunderstood that this is part of the project. Yeah.
Question?
Thank you for your speech today. I think it was very interesting. There's a question that arises when you look in the perspective of multiple scales, of multiplicity of scales, which is different concepts of order that stick with particular cultures. And within a world in which we are looking forward to a system that will connect London to Tokyo in half an hour, and speaking about the organized rocket system. How do you see, what is your take on how do you relate this multiplicity of scales, which is the topic of the universal versus the local, or the particular versus the universal communication systems?
I mean, it's very important. So we have, what I find interesting, when you have a very, very rich formal repertoires, and nearly like the endless form of nature, and I started to show some of just the 4 pavilions of Appiah Mendes, for instance, that you can make things similar and different at the same time, because there's so many dimensions of comparison that it could be similar to many different things on the different dimensions and contrasting to other things, and so that's why these identities and urban identities will be necessary. There's particular identities of buildings, urban districts, whole cities, regions, but then you also, there's things like the similarity of central centers of financial districts across different regions and cities. So if you connect rapidly from the center of New York to Tokyo, and they become functionally interactive, then they should also feel that one is just an extension of the other. You move continuously through this tunnel, and then you still in the same texture of the financial district, and you have then the HSBC New York branch right after you've exited the Tokyo branch, etc. So this is possible too, and it doesn't mean that then there's also a difference between New York and Tokyo with various textures. So you can go similar and different, and I believe in this. So we've studied the semiological system and started to evolve that level of complexity, and this is something which is also open-ended. Nobody has, in fact, multi-authorship is also multi-authorship not only in the utterances of the various designs, but multi-authorship in the language itself. So we share a language which nobody has designed, and everybody is a creative user, but also there are poets and people who create neologisms, and every new text is actually restitching up scientific text and vocabulary. So that's why I also see this language is not a kind of singular hand, it's an evolving system, bottom up itself. And it really is a world society we're living in. So it is expressing similarities and continuities across the globe, as well as differences within cities and between continents.
Hi Patrik, thanks a lot again. I have a short question. How about the eloquent citizen? So the lack of, actually, you know, if you look at politics and all these kind of things, you could say that there's very few that understand or have the desire for elegant design, cityscape, and probably rather populism or comic relief, neo-promo, perhaps also one supporter. How do you deal with that? Is that because you also discussed the eloquent architect,
Yeah.
sophisticated architect? So how about the
Look,
just expansion?
Look, maybe I'm an optimist, but I believe that if these environments emerge by market leaders, by us as being avant-garde, propositional market leader, we're bold, but we understand the societal forces, a bit like Corbusier, incredibly bold vision of the industrial city, of the Ville Radieuse in 1924, and it was redeemed. He was right, because he understood industrial society. He understood the socialist society, let's say. So I think I trust in that our intuitions could lead somewhere, and once it starts to manifest, it will become popular. I have actually experiences with our buildings which are unusually popular. And the thing is that we can't allow the populism to interfere in the planning, because when we talk ideas, when we look at drawings, we don't find that buy-in, understanding. We get enormous amount of pushback and rejection of our propositions when they're in the state of a drawing. For instance, in Dongdaemun and so on. Against all this resistance, somebody, and that we need the freedom of the entrepreneur, we need that and the right to build and take the risk. If you fail, you lose your capital, somebody else can take the site. But if you win, you're winning with people voting with their feet on the ground by going and frequent your place. And this was a huge success in Korea for us, our project, for instance, and several others, which were violently rejected in the media and by architects, and were decried as being alien and horrible, and became super popular. So I have that optimism that you don't need the theoretical understanding from the eloquent citizen. You need to just the intuitive grasp and the functioning. And that's with a lot of new things we have, where entrepreneurs just had the guts and balls to proposition, but we need to try and error. There will be also a lot of failures. But that's the way I see it. So I don't rely on, that's why I'm skeptical of having too much democratic decision making, where you have to in advance of the product being tangibly there, align too many people, and then you have a lot of paranoia, a lot of fear, a lot of conservatism. And I think we need the discovery process of the market, where people in the end who've been ranting against it actually go once who are kind of using it and running with it. That's my hope. So that's why there's also a political edge to this, in terms of more degrees of freedom for entrepreneurs to try and fail or succeed, and not having to convince a majority in advance. That's very hard. That you would never do. That will be very, very tough. Then we have paralysis. And we need to have the discovery process of entrepreneurial risk takers. And I see myself like this, and the avant-gardists in the architectural field. But I think with theory guidance and with an understanding where society is actually moving and what society requires, you can have compelling and probably succeeding anticipation intuitions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Patrik. We have to conclude this morning's session. I'd like to thank Patrik Schumacher for an amazing talk. 6 years ago when this was started, Patrik and I talked about the Biennale sessions and the 100-year city program as being fantastic because it gave the opportunity for this type of discussion. And that's what the Biennale should be about. It's about enriching this type of repertoire conversation to develop a future of thinking about architecture. It's not curated by one person, it's curated by schools, it's curated by like-minded academic participation, by giving an opportunity to create thinking about this future. It's not a top-down, it's a bottom-up approach. And I think what's been really significant about what we're doing here is that we're opening up a discourse about what architecture could be, what urbanism could be, but in the right way, as a discussion. And this is the beginning of what we need to think about when we think about cities and architecture. And Patrik gave a really amazing talk today about the position of how he thinks about architecture, how he, through Zaha the architects, developed this possible future scenario, and how we all should be thinking in our own ways about developing this future for architectural thinking. So again, I'd like to thank Patrik and remind you all that the studio sessions commence at 2 o'clock today in the space here, which is actually one level up. And we'll be discussing with guest panelists, including Patrik, the projects and in a school studio review manner. So I'd like you to join us at 2 o'clock and thank Patrik again.
Thank you, guys.